Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Lauren, and we're excited to have you here for today's panel. This is the first event of a three-part series hosted by URBAN-X, the mini-backed startup accelerator in partnership with Newlab, on how startups can navigate an increasingly digital world, especially startups focused on hardware. So we have three amazing speakers joining us today for the first part of the series, which is on getting remote work right. So the way today will work is we'll have each of our speakers give a few-minute introduction on their background and their work. Then we'll dive right into the panel and leave some time at the end for audience questions. So if you have any questions throughout the panel, feel free to put it into the chat or leave a comment, and we'll do our best to get to all questions at the end. So with that, I'll hand it over first to Sean Stewart, the CEO of Newlab, to give us a little bit of background.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So nice to meet you all. I'm Sean Stewart. I'm the CEO here in the Brooklyn Navy out at Newlab. We're a community of frontier technology entrepreneurs building just over 170 different companies based right here in Brooklyn. And we run innovation studios, which are partnerships with corporate clients to develop new hardware and pilot those solutions around their problem sets. And we also have a venture studio here that builds companies from the ground up, funded by Newlab. Lauren and I met each other at Google X, where we were involved with Waymo, and that was kind of my life before Newlab, and thrilled to be here to talk about this important topic today.
Thanks so much, Sean. Next up, we have James Calhoun, who's the founder of Rehash Studio and URBAN-X expert in residence. James?
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me. Rehash Studio is a digital design agency. We help startups and enterprise companies build software solutions. And for most of the last 20 years, I've worked with remote teams to build software. And in the last few years, I've brought that experience over to URBAN-X as the expert in residence focused on software development, where I work with teams to help them understand how they will embrace, often remote development, and working with teams across the world, different time zones, et cetera.
Fantastic. Happy to have you, James. And last is Ignasi Lluch. He's the co-founder and CTO of Nearspace Labs. Ignasi?
Yes. So I founded Nearspace Labs in 2017 when we were one of the first companies, cohort 3 of URBAN-X. So happy to be here. Back chatting with people who appreciate a lot in URBAN-X. And basically at Nearspace Labs, what we do is we design, build, and operate high-altitude stratospheric balloons, and we use those for aerial imaging. That has specific advantages against satellites and drones and other means of aerial imaging. And my background is coming from aerospace and big aerospace industry. I have a PhD in satellite systems engineering. So I was coming from this angle of, big systems, hundreds of people, millions of dollars, put into large 7-year, 10-year projects. And suddenly in 2017, I'm in this little startup that is trying to do these small robots that have to fly as soon as possible, as quick as possible, with much smaller resources. And there's a lot of interesting stories on how to make this hardware and what didn't go well and what did go well. And I'm really happy today to have this chance to speak about these topics that are really a passion for us in here at Nearspace Labs.
Yeah, stratospheric balloons don't sound complicated at all. So no, thank you so much. So to start off, I'd love to start with Sean to tell us a little bit more about sort of taking us back to the start of the pandemic. Your members are just starting to realize, oh my God, we're going remote. What are those first few weeks like for the members of Newlab?
Yeah, so it's good to kind of set the stage. We've got just over 170 different companies based here, and 55% of them have a hardware product of some sort involved in their venture and what they're building. So if you go back to March of last year, you essentially had two different panic buttons occurring at the same time. Like the first was obviously there was a global pandemic, which was just in its infancy. All of us trying to figure out what we need to be worried about, how we need to navigate our personal lives and the decisions we had to make to be safe and healthy through that experience, which was troubling enough. Then you had the secondary threat of an existential threat to your business, which is if you're 3D printing rocket engines, you're developing electric motorcycles, you're growing leather from collagen, these are some of the examples of what companies are doing here at Newlab on a daily basis. The concept of being locked out of those labs, that community, that equipment, that access to facilities, those pilot zones that you need, was terrifying for businesses. Like, these are businesses that are already suspending, in a suspension of disbelief of like that you can actually build a startup. It's an incredibly challenging thing to be successful at. To then have these additional threats layered on top of it became very, very difficult. And so in a world where typical office space employees were coming to companies and saying, why aren't you sending us all home? What's the protocol? We shouldn't be here. We had the opposite, which was companies saying, you need to stay open. You need to give us access to this equipment, the laboratories, the community, the pilots we were planning to launch. You can't shut down. It will add an additional layer of threat to our business, which is already under threat in regards to their likelihood to succeed. And so the one piece that happened that really turned the corner for us and really changed the situation was the New York City government called us, both at the state level and city level, and essentially outlined a challenge they were having around bridge ventilators. That New York City hospitals were running out of the hardware necessary to keep patients breathing during the kind of extreme reactions to COVID-19. And so they gave us a scope of work to develop and deliver bridge ventilators to New York City hospitals in a pretty rapid period of time. And that then categorized Newlab as an essential business, which meant we could stay open. We continued to operate on developing and delivering those ventilators, and allowed other companies to continue their product development, their pilots. And so we never closed. We remained active. And so at the lowest point, you had 50 people here per day, and then it just climbed back up from April onwards to where we are today, which is you have 250 to 300 people coming here on a daily basis to build their companies.
That is a fascinating way to both adapt to the situation and do some good for the community, and just shows the power, I think, of Newlab and all you can do there. Fantastic. And so Ignasi, your hardware group kind of pre-pandemic was already kind of distributed, kind of remote. You want to tell us a little bit about what Near Space Labs was like pre-pandemic, and whether you still needed to change and make adjustments during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. So for people to understand, we have like 3 different physical locations that interact with our hardware. Here in Barcelona, where I sit, we design, prototype, and build the flight vehicles. But then they get assembled and maintained in New York, and they operated in a 3rd different physical location that depends where we're flying, where we're actually capturing imaging. That's what we do with our devices. So this was already going on and happening before the pandemic. So we had to have the resources and the manuals and the thinking to organize all those things. But surprisingly, or not surprisingly, like, we believed that knowledge transfer still happens when you move people, not when you move documentation. Like, knowledge fundamentally lives in people as much as we try to put it in documentation. So we were obviously flying a lot. We would have design engineers going into operations, seeing how the operation is going. We will have operators going into assembly line, vice versa. So there was a lot of flights from Barcelona, New York, to Texas, where we operate, to California, to all those places. And suddenly you cannot do that anymore. And that was really, really shocking. As Sean said, there was a bit of panic. We felt threatened as a business, because how are we going to continue to do this successfully if suddenly I cannot send my best engineers to figure out a very challenging project, and this operations team has to figure on their own. So we went into 2020 mode with we went all video with our documentation. So we had a lot of training manuals that went into people sitting with the hardware explaining what you should do. And this is very obvious to everyone in their consumer experience, that things should be videos. But in big industry or hardware making or aerospace, it's not obvious that your documentation should be actually videos. And this was something that helped immensely all the teams operate successfully. And then you figure out a lot of things that you should have figured anyway, but the pandemic accelerated. Like, I'm going to explain a little horror story that we had when, this vehicle we operate, it has hexagonal shape, right? So there's some sensors that go on a top lid that is a hexagon, and then there's a lot of avionics that go into another hexagonal box, and then there's the payload bay that is also has like a hexagonal shape, right, where all the camera equipment goes. So obviously for the people who design it, and even for the people who assembled it, it was very obvious how you have to assemble it. But if you think about this, there's 36 ways you can assemble 3 hexagonal boxes stacked one on top of each other, and nobody thought that you can have 36 ways to put it. So at some point, some operator had to make an emergency, on the spot repair, and they fix it wrong, and suddenly we're taking images of the opposite direction, in the south instead of the north of whatever city we were imaging, right? And that's very obvious, and you just have to mount a Poca yoke, some kind of behavior shaping constraint in your design. And the people at URBAN-X that are very strong in industrial design, they're gonna shout at me, and it's very obvious. But when you're coming from trying to hack things as fast as you can, you don't discover those things until it's mid production sometimes. So I think we learned a lot about how you want to test things and how you want to document and how you want to really assume even your inside team that is operating the vehicle will have not the same knowledge as you have, and they will be remote, and you're not going to be able to sit with them and mount the thing physically. So they have to understand, and you have to understand everything that can go wrong.
Honestly, that hexagon sounds like a survivor challenge. So any survivor fans out there, no, that's awesome. And then James, your background is in software. So remote work is much more common sort of in the companies where you've worked. Can you talk a little bit about what asynchronous work is and how it shapes software and how it might have been helpful to hardware organizations during this transition period?
Sure. So to me, asynchronous work is really all about breaking tasks up into small enough chunks that they can be assigned to different people with different areas of expertise and be able to move in a very nimble fashion. These things can be developed without as many dependencies as possible. They can move. One person can be working on one little piece and somebody else can be working on another little piece, and you can plug them all together. One of the things that we've always done in the software space is work with people with different expertise, which often means they're not in the office. There have been times where in my past work environments where we had full teams all together in one space, but the vast majority of the time we had teams who were distributed in different locations, not always in the same country or time zone. And so you couldn't afford to take a big feature set and have it sort of move through this production pipeline in a as one piece. It would the review cycles, the iteration cycles slow down a lot. So for us, it's always about breaking things down into very small chunks that can be moved independently and reducing the dependency on one feature blocking another. So it's all about making sure that people can work at their own time with their own expertise at their own location.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're all learning to live with, and it's nice that you had a little bit of a head start on many folks coming into the pandemic. And so Ignasi, so you sort of hit you figure out the emergency brake, you stabilize the company right off the bat. But we're in this for a very long time. So you need to make sure that product development generally stays on track. What tools are you using to ensure product development does stay on track?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into like the basic tools that I think everyone should be using, and it's not going to be news that, we use Jira like most software teams, but also for hardware. We use Agile project management also for hardware, Slack, Confluence, all sorts of tools. But I think more specifically for hardware, you should be using continuous integration also for your embedded code. And if, depending on the hardware you're building, your embedded people, your developers, your engineers can have that hardware home, right? So a lot of onboard computers and different hardware can be tested home, or you can also have your machine still in the office, lights off. You only have your target machine, your robot, but it's connected to a continuous integration pipeline, so people can compile the code from home, send it to the office, and check that it compiles on the target robot machine. So that's super important to understand that, everything that's software, even if it's for autonomous vehicles, IoT, you can still do a lot home or distributed. And then one thing that we learned from being distributed even before the pandemic, but now it's becoming more and more important, are how we organize all the different calls and Zoom that we're all going to have through the day. And we're all in, all sorts of different calls through the day. But there's two types of meetings or online gatherings that I think have been very important for what we do and for the company and the product. And those are the ones that are actually less organized, one would think. And we have all sorts of like milestone and progress meetings and etc. But the disorganized ones, quote unquote, are very important. So we will have this stand up every day where everyone just says what they're doing. And this is very obvious, but it's not an engineering team. We have it from CEO to the last intern. And a lot of things come up from just knowing what business is doing, what CEO is doing, what the last intern is doing. It really helps coordinate and make sure everyone's on the same page, to have everyone for 3 minutes on the same room. If you cannot enforce that in the physical world, you should enforce that in the digital world. And another thing that happens important is like, we actually don't get very nervous about the efficiency of meetings. Like if there's chit chat before the meeting and after the meeting, and there's some part of the meeting space that is informal, it's actually good because you're missing the water cooler banter, right? And you're missing the just crossing some other colleague, being in front of their desk and thinking, oh, they're doing that. That's interesting. Let's chat because we have an interface here we have to figure out. And when you are co-located, especially in a small startup, everything again under the same roof strategy, that works very well. The concurrent engineering, the concurrent aspect of things. But when you're not co-located, you have to formalize this in some way. And one way we found is actually, be tolerant and actually engaging in going a bit over the meetings and segueing into things and being tolerant with that, because a lot of things come up that are going to be the problem of tomorrow, or some interfaces that you haven't figured in all the other formal spaces that you had.
Yeah, that water cooler conversation is in some ways irreplaceable, but it's good to hear that you've been able to sort of replicate some of it in your day-to-day. I know, James, you're a big fan of tech tips and tricks. So across Slack and other ways to stay connected and maybe recreate some of that water cooler conversation. What are some of your favorite tips and tricks that others might be able to use in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually, we have a lot of custom, it's very simple, but customizations that we've done in Slack that make the Slack experience a little bit more fun. And, custom emojis, we make like custom animated emojis that, people's pets, things like this, that somebody's dog can be animated and stamping around as a form of excitement. And so we have a lot of custom reaction emojis that we use. And these are very subtle, small things that bring personality into this interaction that can otherwise be fairly stale. I mean, Slack becomes our main method of communication. We use that 90+% of the time, or email meetings are way down. And so in Slack, we really like to customize that experience. We like to build channels that give people a space to interact on non-work topics as well. Book club, a random channel, an applaud channel where we use that to shout people out for things they've accomplished. So although these feel sort of small, they create this opportunity to use the platform to manage a distributed team in a way that sort of feels like you're building a culture.
And that's so important as people are disconnected and kind of off isolated, and bringing them back in using those tools is, I'm sure, makes a big difference. And so, Sean, you have some people in the office, but it's obviously a very different environment. How are you keeping the culture of Newlab really strong? And did you feel like your members maybe had different needs during this period of time than they otherwise would have?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And certainly some of the tips so far have been pretty relevant to how we've done it too. I think the first piece was we went out and surveyed the community and said, what do you need during this time? Like, you can't really speak for 900 people without actually asking them, what are your employees feeling? What do they need to feel safe and secure? And we ended up developing a list of all the concerns that people had of coming to work every day in this community, first on the ventilator project, but then on the others. And so those problems were, fear around contact tracing and social distancing, and the health metrics being taken at the door, and how we were going to ensure that Newlab wasn't just a contamination zone with all these active engineers. And then what we did was develop that list of concerns, and then went back to the same community and said, can you help us solve these? So we said we need a solution that tells you what the occupancy of a bathroom is before you enter it. And so someone customized a radar solution to give external views into the amount of bodies in a bathroom without invading privacy. We needed a way to give feedback if you were within 7 feet of distance of someone for a consistent amount of time to avoid that potential contamination. So we worked with strong arm technologies that built a small haptic sensor that we all literally wore every day, and it would vibrate if we were in a certain distance within someone for too long. Then the same technology was used for contact tracing, which was if someone tested positive in the community, that sensor allowed us to tell who they interacted with, what parts of the building they went into. Then we needed screening systems for entry and exit of the buildings, and so Norbert Health built a sensor for providing heart rate and temperature level readings as you entered a building to screen out people who might have been infected at that time. So the first was we didn't tell them what the solutions were. We didn't tell them what to be worried about. We actually involved them in that process and then involved them in the solutions. And the result of that was really strong, that people wanted to come back because they had been part of the process of developing the system. So that helped with the in-person activity that was still there. But as you mentioned, like 80% of the community wasn't coming here daily. They didn't have requirements or urgency around that. And so I think it was already mentioned that there was so many positives that did come out of this challenging year. And one of them was this entire shift of a lot of our programming and content and convenings and moving that to an online world. We moved all of the content and webinars, the workshops, all of it became virtual online content. And then with that, we were able to make it public and allow people who had nothing to do with the Newlab community to attend. We're doing a one-on-one workshop on quantum computers and the management of qubits. You could be a resident of Brooklyn, you could be a resident of Sydney, Australia, and you could come attend these workshops and learn about what was happening in these fields. So we really just re-examined every aspect of the business and thought, all right, how do you still maintain this? What was the goal of it? Like, the goal was to get people to collaborate. That doesn't require physical. As we mentioned, like, water-cooled conversations can happen at the start and an end of a Google Hangouts or a Zoom meeting. And so really take a step back and say, what was the reason to do this? You had a happy hour. What was the actual output you were looking for? And then you had to re-engineer all of those solutions to now do the same thing in the virtual environment. And it ended up being quite successful. The programming became a way for people to convene and connect. And I love that comment about you also needed to we created opportunities for CEOs to connect with no agenda. Just you still needed that ability in that environment that allowed for just discussion to see what would come out of it. And so it was just a helpful exercise to go back to the roots of, like, what did we intend to happen with this effort? Now, can you still get to that end goal, even with all these hurdles that the world had just put in front of us? And it was largely successful in that way.
And do you think some of that new programming is here to stay? What's the reception been?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples now where things are here to stay. I mean, if you hire the right talent, what we largely found was that they were equally productive in the workplace and outside of the workplace, that good people didn't want to stay at home and be unproductive. They wanted to find the ways to get stuff done. And the people who needed labs and equipments, they found a way to still be productive in that environment as well. And so I think you're starting to see more of that flexibility, obviously, that you can trust that your workforce is equally productive. Actually, what you learned about them was the opposite, that at-home work environment meant people didn't know when to shut off. You didn't take a work call at 9 o'clock pre-pandemic, but suddenly if your kitchen was your workplace, like, where were the boundaries? vacation time. People weren't taking it. Like you had to be more active at actually pushing people to have downtime, to create a separation between work and life balance, because the physical used to be part of that distance. You used to leave work and then feel like I'm no longer responsible for picking up the phone unless it's urgent or there's clearly a need. That all kind of went out the window with the pandemic. And so a lot of it was that we learned the right hiring the right people. You had to protect them versus monitoring them. This wasn't micromanagement. This was actually, how do we ensure you're still healthy and still going to survive this period and come out stronger and still motivated despite the stress and tension on all of us on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for you, Ignasi, when you think about on that note, sort of the way that the pandemic has changed the way that people work and your company works, what are some of the things that you've tried or changed that worked really well, or maybe some that didn't work as well?
Several. Because of we had to send people to work from home, and then we still had hardware to do. So we actually entered a bit of a shift dynamic, and we would have people coming some days and just being in the office with the hardware because they had to do something that could not be done otherwise, etc. So people started going to this hybrid mode of, some days I'll come into the office to work on the hardware, and some days I'll work from home into other things, and being able to understand what I can do from every place. Because before pandemic, for a hardware company, there was no second thoughts. Like, you have to be where the action is, where the hardware is. And if you're doing it in any lab environment, any workshop environment, it looked pretty obvious. And now we saw that, software can go fully remote, and it was fully remote before, but hardware can go partially remote, right? With the tools I've mentioned before, but also with a nice strategy with, you can take some things home, some other stuff. You can select when you go to the office to, screw a bolt specifically, but some other stuff you can do from home. And now we start to have people post-pandemic that want to specify, like, I want to have 1 day off, 2 days off, 3 days off a week, and go to this hybrid mode, which I think it's starting to be something for hardware that we haven't seen before. But we see it's viable, and we see it's something that we can give that flexibility to engineers who also work with hardware. And then in terms of engineering and logistics, we had to figure out all sorts of things that are working well. We had to, from scratch, our logistics wasn't very up to the challenge of shipping internationally all the devices across our locations and in a timely manner, and duplicating all the tool chains. And we had to do that. And now this is an asset we have. Things that are obvious, like having strong inventorying systems that are having good UX, and they are easy to use, and they're probably browser-based, and everybody from New York, Barcelona can understand what's in the Texas office and what do they have there. We're super strong on checklists. We love checklists. This is, I think, inheritance from aerospace, but we have this. And we discovered this next level checklist that is not going to be your Google Keep, but it's going to be something that you can track at what time each step was created. You can assign people to these tasks. And there's also, I'm not going to mention any specific one, but there's really, really great products coming online for checklisting that you can use not only for engineering, for all sorts of things, for onboarding people. And we use them all across the board. And some other thing we've been doing, started in pandemic times, but it's also connected with like documentation and how do we think about assembling our vehicles and maintaining our vehicles. Is we're gonna use beta testers from the company, and we're gonna make these videos that I was talking before, and we're gonna, with this video on the documentation and a screwdriver and maybe a cable crimp or a wire cutter, you're gonna try to mount this piece of equipment, and we give it to somebody in the business team or somebody who doesn't have any relation with the hardware, and see if they manage, see if they're actually able to follow our instructions are good enough outside, the knowledge domain that you might have to build that. And all those things that we had to deploy, we're gonna carry over, and they're gonna contribute significant value to what we're doing and make it actually better place to work for people who are in the hardware world.
Sounds like you sort of had to up. Oh, so go ahead.
No, I don't know if we could jump in, but I feel like that inventory management piece was really insightful. And also the amount of companies who had massive epiphanies around supply chain, inventory management through the entire supply chain of their hardware. Like, not many of them have ever considered that continents or countries would shut down in regards to exports. And not many of them had backup plans in regards to volatile supply chains. If you can't get the sensor you need out of Shenzhen, what's your backup plan? Do you have a domestic location or source of them? Have you looked at Hanoi in Vietnam? Are you working in Taiwan? Like, you now see companies developing their hardware and supply chain, their inventory management in a way that assumes a worst case scenario that nobody ever thought of, that nobody ever thought you could have this, the micromobility companies that now can't get chips to release their scooters. Or there's parking lots of Ford F-150s in Detroit that are waiting for chips to be deployed and sold. Like, no one had ever considered this kind of catastrophic level of supply chain disruption. And I think now you have to. Now you have to actually prepare for that potential outcome. And you see the same with cash on hand and runway management, that companies used to be comfortable and be able to sleep at night with like 8 to 12 months of cash on hand because the assumption was the cash flow or the revenue you're seeing today, it usually is diverse enough where it's not going to all shut down overnight. You're not going to see everything disappear without warning. The new normal is that's a possibility from today onwards, that there can be another one of these and your revenue can go from 10 million to zero in the period of 48 hours. Your supply chain can break in 48 hours. You can go from a 3-week waiting list for a sensor to a 3-year waiting list for a sensor. And so now you have definitely more risk-averse founders and entrepreneurs, but a lot more detail and planning going into supply chain for these worst-case disruptions, which is, I think, has been really important and valuable, right? Like, you're actually preparing for something you never thought could come to your house, and that probably is a positive. And then the flip side is the founders who are willing to continue to operate with that level of risk, whether there's benefit there or consequence, will be interesting to see.
It's almost like, the pandemic forced companies to mature certain processes and certain, the next level checklists and the next level backup suppliers that you wouldn't have had to do for a company as early as some of the companies that we're talking about. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions from the audience. A reminder to anyone who missed it, put any questions in the chat or in comments and we'll try to get to them. But the first audience question, maybe we can start with James, but anyone feel free to hop in. So someone asks, what are some good strategies to break large projects or products down into manageable chunks so that people can work on them independently?
Well, so it's a good question. It's hard to think about in the abstract. I mean, I think that is the lens by which I'm always looking at a problem, is that is what are the components of this, right? And so I think a good sort of rubric you can use to measure whether or not it's small enough. One is the amount of time it might take to complete, right? So when we estimate tasks in an agile methodology, we are often estimating them based on their complexity. We're not using time so much as we're using a level of effort. Is this no questions asked? We can do this with the information I have in front of me. Is this going to take, that's sort of like a very small task. If it is something that's going to take a little bit of experimentation or research, 2, if it's going to take a collaborative effort, I'm going to need to meet with more than one person. I'm going to need to talk with multiple people and research and then test and then build, right? When it gets to that phase, it's we see that as a larger item, right? Our goal is to make everything fit into the first bucket. Everything that's in our ticket management system, everything that we're discussing is granular in that way. And so that's just sort of the mindset that I'm looking at projects with. So, typically there's organizing principles in the agile methodology that one could reference, but, we think of Jira has this built in, this notion of, is it an epic of which describes a set of features? Is it a feature or is it a to-do list within that feature, right? That's sort of a common metaphor. So to us, we want to take big ideas, express them as a series of epics, break those epics into individual features, and those features at most could have to-do list items. But for us, a feature needs to be able to be reviewed and tested independently and shippable independently from the rest of the component. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful for the context of the question, but typically we're looking to make them as small as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Totally.
I can also.
Go ahead, Ignasi.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry to cut. So I think I want to also add a couple ideas from the hardware front on the very same question, and attack it more from the angle from systems engineering, right? So when you're building a hardware product, it's going to have a series of, let's say, it's subsystems or components that are part of that, and you're going to draft those different subsystems that make your hardware product, right? And one thing that it's going to help you a great deal is if you see the interfaces, you draw the connections like, oh, there's this cable here, and this is a USB connector here, and I need this sensor wire there, and there's a physical, some parts, some mechanical part in here. So you see all the interfaces between your subsystems, and this diagram you can do in, 20 minutes. You're gonna see that a lot of your things that you just diagram have a lot of connections to other things, and maybe those should be clustered together. So put all the interfaces within the subsystem and reduce the interfaces between your subsystems. And this is a neat way where you're going to be able to compartmentalize tightly coupled things that you should do as chunks, right? First, do the tightly coupled things because it's easier to do them together, and you can separate them better than the other things. So just think on how you can separate your subsystems with minimal interfaces so you can work in chunks. And the other thing that has been fundamental for us, because we have a very complex technology stack, that we couldn't start and tackle the whole problem from the beginning, from the pre-seed or seed round. We had to go step by step. So from all these different components that make your product, you gotta have to be focusing on the work that gives maximum de-risking. If you're a venture-funded startup, you're gonna go into this, eventually showing this technology, presenting this technology, justifying why this technology has a moat, why you are the right team, why you are able to execute on this technology. And as an engineer of the company, one of your biggest concerns when you go into raise VC funding is, have I de-risked my technology, my product? Have I attacked the most difficult problem I have of all those components? And have I demonstrated I know how to do that in a prototype way, in a proxy way, or building the thing? However, depending on the results you have, on the resources you have, but being able to de-risk that chunk, once you have identified what's the critical component, it's going to be fundamental, because sometimes you cannot tackle the whole thing, right? And you're going to fail if you try to build the end-to-end thing. Just demonstrate the key components first.
Yeah, I think I don't know, Lauren, if you remember the monkey reciting Shakespeare on a stage metaphor at Google X. Yeah,
Absolutely,
it's like
yes.
one of the common things they say about the projects at Google, which is, if your project is to train a monkey to recite Shakespeare on a stage with a microphone, don't waste time on building the stage. Don't waste time building the microphone. You have to prove that the most complex part of the solution can actually be done, and you have to focus your efforts there. And so there's been great management or tips on how you manage these processes. But that last point of the most crucial component to the hardware, the most crucial technology to the solution, that has to be proven out first. Don't waste the resources and the time on the follow-on tasks and features if you haven't justified yet that the first most crucial element actually is achievable, if that makes sense.
Definitely need to start with the singing monkey. That's true. And so I think on a separate topic, but something that we're hearing from the audience, and maybe we can start, Sean, with you and hear from everyone else. But the question is, with more and more people being vaccinated, do you think we'll all go back to the old 9 to 5, or do you think the pandemic will have a lasting effect on how we work?
I think it's not as extreme as some people are writing. The thing I always remember, I lived in New York for 9/11, and a couple months after 9/11, there was an op-ed, I think in the Times, that said there will never be buildings more than 20 floors high in New York, ever again. And you kind of read it and thought, really? Like, this is going to just alter the urban landscape forever because of this one incident. And I think you're seeing those type of opinion pieces that are, people will never go back to work, into offices. And I think that extreme statement isn't actually that accurate. And you only need to ask someone like myself, who has a 3-year-old kid, whether I want to go to work every day. And you'll get a consistent view that going to work is something quite positive and for a lot of people's productivity and mental health. I think the difference now is we all understand that we can succeed and grow and hit the achievements we want with a greater flexibility than maybe what was provided prior to the pandemic. I think the concept of people working 2 days a week or 3 days a week in an office and 2 days a week remotely is going to be far more common. There will be people who are happier 5 days a week being remote. I'm not surrounded by a lot of them. I'm around people who value collaboration and interaction and spontaneity. And you don't, as someone mentioned before, like, you don't come up with some random idea on a Zoom call that's scheduled from 8 to 9 to talk about the financial, projections for the business. And so there still needs to be that social element and interaction. I think the world is just going to be far more flexible to where people are based and how they want to work and making that fit. And if you're an engineer, that's actually existed for a long time. Like, I've had engineers at companies who only worked from 9 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning. I had engineers who liked to work in offices with dark lights and didn't want to interact socially. There's been worlds where the work experience has been customized for talent based on their desires for a long time. It just hasn't been consistent around every work and every occupation. And I think now you can say, I'm an accountant and I only want to come to the office 2 days a week. And you'll have people who are okay with that. The efforts people will go to make talent comfortable and attractive as a workplace, I think, has just gone up a notch. But the concept that we're all going to work from home for the rest of our lives, like, I think that's a bit extreme, and I don't see the evidence of that day to day. We're just getting through vaccination rates in New York, and we are back to occupancy levels. We're 100% occupied here, and we have 250 to 300 people here every day, which is the way it was before the pandemic. As soon as people felt safe coming back to a community like this, they did. And that wasn't because anyone forced them to. That's because they're happier with that type of distance and that ability to segment their life between personal and professional in some way.
For me, I would say that I think everything Sean said is I don't disagree with any of that. I do know that on the software side, and I imagine this will bleed into other companies, that we really lean into the flexibility that that we've always had, but especially that's been afforded to us as our clients and our partners and collaborators have embraced sort of the change that's come around in the last year. And that means that we love celebrating different time zones, different work patterns, different 9 to 5 has always been very strange for us. Almost in my industry, I've very rarely had a team that's worked in those hours. There's always been teams that work at flexible times, and as Sean was saying, people at night. But that's even extended more to the point where people are working in have moved, have relocated, and are enjoying different scenery. And I expect that we'll see a lot of that type of flexibility on not only time of day, but location. And that's going to open up companies to have a lot of opportunities to hire people with different skills and expertise in different regions. So I think we'll see increased distribution of teams where as you start getting comfortable with the idea, you don't have to be in one physical space during one set of hours. The next sort of step is then that person can be anywhere and I can get access to experts who are in a completely different community than where my business is located.
That's great. And this one, I know we've speaking of hiring talent in a lot of different places, the next audience question is relevant to this. And maybe Ignasi, you can kick us off. But do you think this new way of working remotely will encourage people to collaborate more across borders and maybe even cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. Like, this was happening already, especially in the software world. I don't think COVID just accelerated all the trends that were already in place for software. I think for hardware, it's still going to be difficult, right? The co-location aspect is still important, but I'm seeing, at least in Europe, we hired for the whole of European Union. We don't just hire for Spain where we are located. So that's already how it's looking now. And I think, a lot of the aspects of our hardware that don't require you to be as close to get connected as to the metal, like if you're doing something that is embedded, or you blueprinting something, or you even we have people designing electronic circuits and printed circuit boards that are not physically collocated where the equipment is going to be deployed, and that's perfectly fine. And this type of work around hardware, which doesn't require you directly to interact with the metal, I think it's going to be more and more going remote, and obviously more and more opening the possibility of having developers, engineers that are in different time zones. And even I think the whole market of offshore and nearshore that exists for software, why not for some aspects of hardware and design? Absolutely. I think it's already happening, and it's gonna increase and continue happening. And then when you also go to supply chain, and I think Sean will have inputs to that, when you go to supply chain, some companies, especially if you have to go into mass manufacture of components, you will already have to have some, local presence, and probably across time zones. And you're going to have people in Shenzhen, people in New York, people in Europe, doing product management and making decisions on the product that eventually somebody has to execute on remote and build somewhere else, and it has to be shipped. So all those things, all these different global logistics is already happening. So I don't think it's going to be a big deal to intertwine it with also how the design is made, right?
I would also add that as we get more comfortable working across borders, we love, and we've done this a lot in the software space, of course, historically, but now we're really leaning into embracing the cultural differences with other locations. Designing our company calendar, holiday calendar that factors in all of the different regional calendars that regional holidays that people have, and then celebrating it. And these give us those opportunities to discuss those as a group. But when we start thinking about it organizationally, then you can, just even bring it up in meetings and give an opportunity for people to build some relationships over a discussion about traditions or holidays or current events in other regions that you're not as exposed to. So this team building kind of blends with this notion of being able to work remotely with people in other parts of the world and really learn from them.
Awesome. So I think we'll wrap with our last question, which I'll ask all of you to answer. But just sort of looking into the future and putting your shoes in yourself in the shoes of startup founders, what sort of concrete advice would you have for them that are either trying to build a company in this environment, whether it's a distributed team or as a hardware company, or whatever it might be. And so maybe I'll start with you, Ignasi, but we'll get to Sean and James shortly.
Yeah, so I'm very biased by our own experience with hardware, so I'm gonna come from that angle 99% of the time. So basically, I think one of the key ideas is in all startups, but especially when you're building hardware, you're gonna have to be implementing processes that are connected to how you design, how you build, also company processes, organizational processes all across the board. So there's two ways to go around this, especially focusing on how we build. You can go from the adopting all the processes and then just eliminating those that don't work for you, or the opposite, starting with no processes at all and adopt one at a time as soon as things start to break a little bit, right? And we are more of the second opinion, that we would recommend you to know exactly what you're missing, like understand how is the traceability of parts, how is the supply chain management, how are the design reviews in a very large company, like take Boeing. How would Boeing build this thing? And they would have a lot of processes, have an understanding of what that means, then discard it all immediately, start from the ground up, and still understanding what you're missing, build just one process at a time what you need to get the things done. Add your supply chain management when you need it, add your traceability when you need it, not a moment before, not too late either. But I think a good rule of thumb always in a startup is, be hitting that edge with across all things, with hiring is also important. Like, but feel what is the moment where your processes start to break, and then implement that thing. Because you also have to sell it internally to your team that is used to be very flexible and very non-bureaucratic, and you will have to sell all these processes one at a time. So you have to show how this is not working now, and you guys clearly see, and we're gonna make an improvement, and everybody is immediately on board. But you have to, be very clear and very deliberate on what every little piece of bureaucracy you build.
Awesome. Thank you for that. James, any concrete advice for startup founders or those working in distributed teams?
Sure. I mean, I think for people who may be going into their first startup, and this may be commonplace now, but asynchronous communication tools is like sort of number one. Just don't use email. Email should be for intros. And then once you're working with somebody, you're out of email. You need to be in a space where you're collaborating in documents and collaborating in a direct chat, group threads, et cetera. So that's one that's sort of basic. I think also really focusing in on your recruiting, onboarding, sort of how you find talent and how you bring that talent in, and then how they're retained, I think is really important, because if you're in an office together, you can see each other, you can get a sense for their work ethic and how people interact with each other. But remotely, you can't. You have to trust that people have the independency. You've given them the agency to perform tasks sort of remotely, and you don't have that same level of day-to-day management. So rather than trying to recreate that through a remote platform, you need to supplement that. You need to sort of change that, where you're really looking at results oriented. And this is probably commonplace for lots of companies, but not all. And I think you do need to think of how you can measure employee performance by looking at the progress they're making on work. And that means breaking work down into small enough chunks that you can see how they're shipping things or delivering things on a daily and weekly basis. So really thinking about how you can get out of sort of any sort of legacy models where there were big meetings to review things, big meetings to plan things. And then lastly, onboarding, recruiting and onboarding, making it easy for somebody to feel welcome in an org and knowing where to go for things is much harder when you can't walk them around the office. So making sure to put those processes down in paper a little bit and continue to iterate on that is really important.
Totally agree. And then Sean, any advice to startup founders besides join Newlab?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general one, and this isn't specific to like decentralized workforces, but we often deal with people who love technology and love R&D, but don't always have the same obsession with market fit and product adoption and retention and customer feedback. And I think X was very much a world like this, where it was build technology, then figure out how to monetize it, versus the reverse. And I think we often have to remind people to do that diligence of like, what are you building? Who are you building it for? How does it compete against the existing market solutions? Just because it uses bleeding edge technology doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be guaranteed to succeed as a product, especially in the B2C world. And so I think that certainly is one of our more general pieces. We talked about supply chain a lot, which I think has been an epiphany that most of our companies are now really focused on, a lot more planning all the way through digitizing their supply chain. And I think I would finish with just James's comment, which expanding on the fact that it's really easy to get, well, not easy, but you can achieve the productivity. You can develop these key results that people are assigned to and measure them on those instead of like when they do the work, like building out a roadmap of what needs to happen and how you get to this end goal, and then measuring people on those accomplishments against those is fantastic. The piece that misses is culture, is exactly what you said, is like, how do you collaborate and feel part of a system? We have employees now who have started at Newlab and never been to the physical building. Like, they started remote and are now starting to kind of experience the physical and meet team members directly face to face. And if I look back, I think the hardest piece of the last 18 months was how to still maintain some semblance of a culture and like the equivalent of the happy hour beer at the end of a tough day. And that I still think is the most difficult to recreate with the tools that we have available. I think all the other elements of product development you can achieve and you can get through. That system of developing and maintaining strong culture and making people feel like they're part of something bigger than just a task list in Jira, that I still think is the most challenging part of this and will continue to be.
Perfect. And also everyone should join Newlab. So before we wrap, I just wanted to remind everyone about the upcoming URBAN-X Summit, which runs from June 1st to the 3rd. It's going to be 3 days of an immersive conversation with the URBAN-X Cohort 9 founders and experts. And the focus will be on how we can use new technologies to help the nation rebound and create safer, healthier, greener, and more enjoyable cities. So it should be a great time. That's June 1st through 3rd, and you can sign up by visiting urbanxsummit.splashthat.com. But thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who joined. It was a great conversation, so thanks for taking the time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.